We are live. Me still, everyone. Right, so thank you everyone for coming back. Hope everyone had a nice good lunch, and it's probably a journey to the fridge and back, right? So next we have coming up Mr. Edward Farrell, or Ed. I love coming to AusCERT. I'll ideally be there in person, but COVID, because I just get to hang out with all my friends, and Ed's a really good friend of mine. So I'm very, very happy to be sharing it virtually with him this year. So Ed's a security consultant with 10 years experience and 15 years in tech, so an incredible amount of experience. He's been around the conference scene for a long time, is a frequent at AusCERT, and he's one of the few remaining directors that are running their own independent security practices these days. Mercury ISS. He has conducted and overseen the delivery of over 300 security assessments, incident responses, and everything in the past 5 years. His professional highlights include lecturing at the Australian Defence Force Academy, being rated the top 200 bug bounty hunters of 2015, very well done, and running an awesome team of security professionals. So his talk, we're actually chatting about it yesterday, I'm really, really looking forward to this one, because as we were kind of discussing yesterday, it's something that comes up quite often on the offensive side. So monitoring the monitors, a path to keeping the SOC in check. So I'll kick it over to Ed, if you could kindly share your screen with the slides there, mate. And without further ado, Mr. Edward Farrell, who's going to tell us how to monitor the monitors.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the warm introduction, Lucas. Just to check, we can all see those slides there. Lucas, feel free to shoot me a message over Slack. Yep, sweet. All right, well, g'day, folks, and welcome to my talk, Monitoring the Monitors, a path to keeping the SOC in check. So my name's Edward Farrell. I've now been doing pen testing for about 10 years and running my own team for the last 5. So funnily enough, my career started off in a network operations center before security was the big thing, focusing on security and then evolving into the offensive side after that. So the last 5 years I've been running my own team, and we do a couple of different assessments. And this has kind of been an evolving thing for us over the last, probably the last 12 months of looking at SOCs that are now all the rage. How do we actually get them working and functioning properly, or even holding them to account? So a little bit of what we'll be going through today. We'll actually discuss what is a SOC, or a security operations center, or an MSP or an MSSP, however we want to term it. Some of the characteristics with these, with a SOC, what's good about them, what's bad, and some underlying concerns, some underpinning concerns that we've had over the years. We'll also discuss some of our broad observations and conclude with, well, a path to how we keep them in check. But I think for me, it's important to start with the story, and this story was really one of those things that had codified a lot of my views and perceptions, and even approaches with how we deal with security operations centers. So this was an internal pen test that my team had sometime last year, where I turned up day one, 9 a.m. And I have a personal preference. When I start a pen test, I like to spin up Wireshark and actually see what's happening on the network that I'm on. A couple of things that we saw, there was Cisco NAC in place that kicked in after about a few minutes. But what was really interesting was, without any authentication or access control, within 2 minutes, we had domain admin, because domain administrators were communicating to a clear text SQL service using their domain credentials. So yeah, all right, this was getting a little bit concerning for us. All right, this is just some basic hygiene stuff that you really should be doing right. Admittedly, we were on an administrative subnet to kick off with, but then about 20 minutes later, we kicked into our first iteration of network scans. Off the back of which we found eternal blue not once, but on 170 different systems. We also found consistent logins as the local administrator, as domain administrators, and off the back of that, we started layering in our RC2 and moving through the network. By the end of the first 4.5 hours, we were camped on the CEO's desktop, recording everything they were doing. We had access to a really sensitive database as well. And it's usually at this point I start initiating incident response, just because the degree to which we were able to get in was a little disconcerting. We managed to also capture a lot of DNS traffic and observe that, hey, there's a bunch of adware going out as well, some other activities that are a little bit concerning. So realistically, I then spent the remainder of day one and a good portion of day two not only going through our post-exploitation scenarios that we factor into our assessments, but I also started thinking, well, someone's beaten us to the mark here, that they would have had to. And unfortunately, we never really got to the bottom of that, because by day three, I had internal audit that was adjacent to our test. So our activities were commissioned by the IT manager. But internal audit was quite insistent that the internal network was secure, because a spreadsheet that was provided by a security operations center said, no, everything's secure. Internal audit was also quite insistent that what we did and the actions we took were inflammatory. They also were insistent that as a mitigating control, that this was an internal network and nothing bad could ever happen, notwithstanding the fact that we were capturing DNS traffic that would suggest otherwise. So off the back of this, we then decided to do a demonstration of what would code execution look like on local systems, off the back of which we managed to create a command and control channel out to our own infrastructure sitting in AWS that allowed us to effectively perform all the actions we did on day one from the internet based on the assumption of malware, which, based on the assumption of malware presented through ad campaigns, which, funnily enough, my colleague, Caleb House, was doing a lot of research on. So he's actually built out some really cool malvertising tools that we had actually hoped to employ on future engagements with single clients like this. But off the back of those, we were able to execute code. Funnily enough, we actually got to a point where we started to say, all right, how far could we get? We got to a point where none of our code was getting obfuscated. This should have been stuff that should have been getting picked up, and it wasn't, and the SOC hadn't seen any of our work at all. So by the end of day three, come back to day one, we kept our OPSEC a little bit limited because this engagement was quite tight. We weren't picked up. By the end of day three, we had no obfuscation. We were using straight out interpreter shells going over HTTPS, and there was absolutely no detection. And this really came back to me, and something that really started to upset me was the internal audit function with this organization had been so convinced that the MSP that they were using had actually taken care of them to a very good standard based purely on spreadsheets and other reports that were getting sent to them, that they were so invested in reinforcing that they were secure that the end result was well, no one really, the end result is still kind of ongoing even 12 months on. But this was also the second time we did this assessment. Previously, I had another staff member deliver this one. This was the one I said, all right, I actually want to have a look at this and really go into a bit of detail on this. Also, it turns out it was the only one free at the time. So for the second time, we actually found 170 instances of eternal blue, which was down from about 250. So it was evident a few people actually knew, hey, the software was actually not getting maintained. We need to probably start looking at it. And so, some of our root causes that formed part of our reporting, our analysis was no one took the time to actually understand and codify what it was that SOC did and actually enforce it, and ensure that the responsibilities and governance were actually getting properly taken care of. I've just noted at the bottom here, our tests were probably about 2 to 3% of what this organisation was paying every year for a managed security service that was doing absolutely nothing. And then, of course, we put that relative to the cost of an attack. If these guys had been, it was by pure luck that this company hadn't actually been hit with a ransomware campaign, just given the ability we were able to achieve with lateral movement. So now that we've had that little appreciation, that story, I guess our next question here really is, well, what is a SOC? So SOCs, MSPs, MSSPs, the term itself varies and changes a lot and is often interchangeable with a lot of language that gets put out there. And so this inconsistency in the term, I think, has actually contributed to understanding what is the role and responsibilities of an outsourced provider that you're employing. So this has kind of been one of those discussions that's been going on for 10 years. And I even remember a colleague of mine that was at AusCERT, would have been about 2011, where he pointed out, well, information security is starting to get called cyber, to which another colleague said, well, look, if our customers want cyber, we'll give them cyber, off the back of which there was this whole piece, especially amongst the more experienced and veteran members of the community of, well, the problem is we're lacking that specificity with what is actually taking place. And I think this has been one of those outcomes of it is someone suddenly spun up a security operations center and clearly they are going to be able to do everything. And so then all of a sudden, we now need to dive deeper into, well, what is it that the actual SOC is doing? Is it conducting an automated scan? Is it conducting some sort of holistic protection? Is it doing some sort of deep level threat hunting activity? Is it doing full traffic capture analysis? Is it maintaining systems? That failure of definition, in my assessment with this company we had contributed to the shortfalls in the setup for this organisation. And so apply that to every internal test that we've done, and this inconsistency is just one of those things that keeps popping up. So it's important to know, okay, this is what a SOC is, but what have they actually said they're doing? So when we start talking about SOC, we actually encompass a very broad church of different firms and organisations that actually are providing professional services on a fairly regular basis to customers. But why would you actually use a SOC? And I think this entire talk isn't here really to disparage a security operations center. I think when they're organised and orchestrated and integrated really well, they're a fantastic asset to have on board. And common traits with this is, if you look at it, you can actually get some really best of breed individuals into that organisation. There's a particular organisation that we've actually come up against where their tech lead, for example, ensures that all of his people are regularly educated. They actually create their own tools. They understand what they're doing. That's a quality and a trait that you're not going to be able to get in your own organisation and set up appropriately. And I've just made a star there because it's something I really want to talk about a little bit later on during this talk. It's also coming back to the availability of easily scalable and cost-effective solutions. So if you simply apply a single capability to your own organisation that's isolated from the rest of Australia, you're not necessarily going to get the intelligence feeds that you would have, say, through a more centralised solution that's covering off, say, the entire industry. But also you're having to pay for that. And you're having to pay for the systems and licensing behind that you might actually be able to get at a cheaper cost if it's scaled amongst and shared amongst multiple individuals. There's always this talk about skill shortage. I'm always 50-50 about the concept that we actually have a skill shortage in this country. In that I think there's actually some really awesome and really talented individuals out there, but we often overlook them because we are looking for someone perfect. So I'll just have that as a side comment there, but one of the points we talk about is skill shortage. Ideally, a SOC will actually be able to address that skill shortage, especially if you're having to deal with real deep subject matter expertise, say in the case of threat hunting and open source intelligence capabilities. I've kind of touched there before on that concentration of four, so you actually have a lot of people there ready to go who have had that exposure to multiple environments, and they're doing this activity day in and day out. And finally, it's important that you should actually be in a position where you start freeing up your internal resources to focus on core tasks that can't be delivered by an outsourcer. So this was always the thing with, say, providing simple, repeatable, reproducible tasks such as server maintenance and laptop fleet management, is if that task be outsourced to a third provider and it's cheaper than the resources that you pay for internally, go for it. But unfortunately, that's not always something that that we see. And all of a sudden, I come back to that term I said about we conflate the language with which we're conducting security, and all of a sudden, our key activities and our core tasks, and even say things like doing a strategic analysis piece that we probably need to be doing ourselves, suddenly gets pushed out. So understanding what your core tasks are and being able to divide those tasks and conduct your division of who's doing what effectively to ensure that your resources are properly managed is fantastic when it's done right. But that really comes back to your internal assessment of, all right, this is what my focus needs to be. But what's actually been really bad, or what have we seen gone terribly wrong in this space? I touched there before on that handover and integration of duties. So does your actual outsourcer understand what their role is and what they're doing, and do they have the context behind the organization that they're actually conducting an assessment on, and that they're actually employing their services against, and off the back of that, does that translate into them being able to detect and respond effectively? So if you're just simply dumping a heap of technology into an organization, that's a little bit disingenuous, and it also disengages from that piece of handing over, integrating, and understanding what it is you're monitoring. And so I also come back to that context piece. This came back off another test we did late last year, where there was a fantastic provider that was in place. The problem is, though, the provider was completely oblivious to the fact that this company was, in fact, on a hybrid cloud and local environment. So the cloud environment wasn't getting monitored, which is where a ton of data was that we were able to exfil effectively. So being unable to map that out and understand that at a very high level was just one of those lessons that got learned, probably more so by the customer than the actual provider of the security service. So supporting processes is another interesting one. Security operations centers or selling SOC as a service. If you are a salesperson, the average cost of a SOC can be anywhere from the low six figures all the way up to, in the case we had before on the scenario I was talking about, into seven figures. So suddenly sales will actually push it. So, and this has been an experience I've seen a lot of it in the last 10 years, is the sales process will actually push ahead and drive the need for these high value services that are notionally niche, but haven't actually gone through and considered things like governance and the operational liability of maintaining those systems. And we'll see that in a second here. Integration as well, and when I talk about integration, that's actually integrating with internal effects as well, or not just simply dumping a bunch of tools, but making sure those tools are effectively orchestrated, and also being able to work between a network operations center that needs to maintain systems and their uptime versus a SOC, which is probably more focused on making sure that everything's been locked down properly. Skilled resources as well is another big problem. So I'll actually come back to that a little bit later in one of the scenarios examples I talk through. Security ownership, so who's responsible for what? If security ownership isn't properly identified as to who owns what and who's responsible where, that also starts to undermine the efficacy of your SOC. Capacity and responsibility, offshoring, visibility, who's maintaining the information. All these are things which go terribly, terribly wrong if there isn't effective management and oversight in getting these capabilities underway. So this was something really peculiar as I started preparing for this talk and started researching. I think this is also part of a broader piece in terms of concerns I have across the industry, which is if we have a look at it, the technical roles, which are usually going to be your people at the coalface, are often neglected in terms of training and development and preparation. So for example, the two cases that I have here are probably a little bit more mature in their training and individual capability development than we have, say, for network operations. But they were two very important ones that, funnily enough, I extracted from one of the security operations providers. That is a project manager, which can be trained up in a weekend, in 5 days for $2,695, excluding GST, will later translate to a salary of this particular company between $120,000 and $156,000. Whereas a diploma in software development, which is going to take time, your average fee is about $7,456 for an end salary of between $53,000 and $96,000, which means that if we were to also apply this approach to the people that we have that are responsible for overseeing and managing technical delivery, if we apply this hierarchical approach there, suddenly the people that we are employing on the ground doing those technical tasks are not necessarily always going to be the best and brightest relative to, say, someone higher up in, say, a project manager role or even in a service delivery management role. So this hierarchical approach to that cost of headcount kind of starts having a very negative influence from a just purely from an economic standpoint, that because we're not paying our technical staff the same level as we do for someone who may have just come into, say, project management and has a very low barrier to entry in terms of qualification and prior skills versus the ongoing development requirements for technical activities, it does actually mean we have a very negative influence on the quality and caliber of individuals that we're going to attract to those roles. Keep those figures in mind when I start talking about our cost of headcount in our analysis here. So we actually started off the back of several engagements we've done. We actually started looking at 3 security operations centers. And across all of these, there was a very heavy emphasis on sales as opposed to the actual delivery of tasks. So one of them had about 30 odd staff, of which they had 5 people in their SOC. They then had a sales workforce of about 10 personnel. So if you come back to the costs that I had illustrated previously, if you've got, say, your 5 techies that are averaging, say, about anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000, that translates to their cost being about $400K. And then you look at, say, a large sales scales or service delivery management task force at a salary cost of, say, about $1.5 million. Suddenly, the only way that those sort of salaries can be sustained is if your SOC is taking on a lot more work than it's actually capable to meet. So suddenly, if there's large-scale incidents, if the SOC isn't well-rehearsed, well-trained, and prepared, this tooth-to-tail ratio will actually start to have a negative impact on their ability to deliver results. Furthermore, we also look at, and this was kind of influenced off the back of an article I was reading on telecommunications industry structure in Canada, the US, Australia for the last couple of years, about how over the last 25 years, because the incentive has actually been focused on quarterly sales as opposed to capability development, we're now at a point where a firm like Harway, which has actually had that focus on capability development, is in a far more mature state and has a lot more capability to provide relative to their competitors in the West. So all of these factors start to incentivize the wrong behavior. So I come back to the piece I was talking about in terms of the cost of labour. Because we're not actually using salaries to attract the right level of labour, plus also if we look at the time and space it requires to actually build out a functional team, as well as that downward pressure on salaries in an outsourcer, the capacity to maintain experience and depth in those organisations starts to have a cumulative negative effect. And then off the back of that, we start to see heavy dependence on tool sets and less on information management and intelligence and organising, just because, and I think I'm still in two minds about this as to whether it's a default or as to whether it's something more tangible, i.e. here is a box, here is a set of software that I'm able to sell and articulate this as a tangible activity, whereas less tangible activities like information management and intelligence are a lot harder to sell and push, and therefore your sales staff will actually fall back onto what's visible. As I said before, and this is a recurring theme that we see in outsourcers, is how do you contextualize and actually understand the environment that you're operating in so that your SOC is actually delivering the intended effects to the customer. So if all you are doing is waiting for someone to run a Nessus scan and you are there to flag that because that's exactly what your tool set's telling you, that's not necessarily going to help say to the level of, well, here's a bunch of DNS requests we had. These are ones that are probably concerning, they're the ones that we probably need to black hole. Interesting observation I also had as well, and this, funnily enough, came off the back of us issuing our pen test report and really rating this firm over the coals. Suddenly, a few months after our work, they employed a pen tester. And this was a single pen tester with no prior experience, who was then their actual pen tester. So we're also starting to see that shift with some of these SOCs to pen testing, as to whether that's legitimately pen testing or we've just given a kid a couple of tools to run and we're calling it pen testing. I think that's going to be interesting. And for me, this is also going to influence the pen testing space in the years to come of, all right, you've now got a pen testing capability, but are they actually thinking through and contextualizing their work, or are they just running tools, which I'm sure Lucas would also agree with me is probably something that we've been seeing a lot more of over the last 6 years. So how do we actually deal with our SOC and how do we keep them in check? One opportunity and approach I've really liked reading up on and executing when I can is this purple teaming approach. That is your pen testers that are outside an objective but remain inside and aware, can actually sit down and collaborate with the SOC effectively and guide them. I make that point of you want them to be outside an objective for the simple fact that if they start integrating with the team, then what extra value are they providing, say, relative to that rotation of a fresh human being and a fresh set of eyes to a project? And if that's iteratively done over time, many eyes make bugs shallow. It actually improves the quality of the team, of the SOC capability, and keeps them fresh and on their toes. The problem is, though, this is a really time-consuming process, and the iterative approach may actually not be what some organisations are looking for. It can also be quite costly, especially if you're paying effectively for a tech resource that has a great deal of subject matter expertise, and you're having to pay for that, 5 or 10 days, once a month or once a quarter. I'd also say this requires a level of maturity as well. So if you have a very hierarchical approach to how you've actually generated your SOC, or if you have a very heavy sales focus, suddenly the sales team thinks that they're constantly getting criticized and that the entire approach is quite negative, which undermines their own confidence or actually turns into something quite standoffish. Additionally, if your pen tester is just here because they like dominating other human beings and like laughing at other people, that actually creates a very negative morale effect. And so if your pen tester is there and they're not actually there to improve the quality of the organization, it's going to really create a massive morale issue, and that's going to do more damage than where you're at beforehand. We can also, of course, keep consistently applying our traditional testing and red teaming approaches, and doing those on a regular ad hoc basis. Reality is that's probably more of a just-in-time audit function. In some ways, it's useful. In a lot of other ways, I don't think that's actually contributed as effectively as we really want to in terms of identifying flaws with SOC providers and actually seeing them improve. So one of the other things, and this is something that we've probably done with 3 or 4 clients over the last few months, is what we've referred to as our SOC validation process. And this is something I'm really keen to actually see get adopted a lot more in industry by fellow testers, by anyone working in a governance capacity, which is to actually do targeted, target any key performance measures and service level agreements that a SOC has actually stipulated they'll do. And if they haven't done that, then coming back to, all right, what is it that you've actually been sold and doesn't make any sense? So by having that KPI or SLA focus, the actual traditional test approach and methodology can be sharpened down to a very tight testing activity. So for example, we had this with a client with whom we would normally do about a 5 or 10 day pen test with. We narrowed down our pen test to 4 hours based on 5 SLAs that the security provider had said they would achieve. And so we were then able to provide a very concise, short, sharp, to the point report saying, here is SLA 1 that they will respond to X event within 4 hours. Here's something they haven't done. But the other element to this, and I think this comes back to incentivizing the right sort of behavior, is to actually focus on cost recovery as part of your effort. So this activity of due diligence and this activity of coming back to money, because right now that's the massive driver behind throwing a SOC at someone, is if you can actually incentivize the right behavior by saying, well, if you don't do the right thing, it's going to cost you more than actually doing the right thing and having the right team, the right capability in play, that's going to lead to a much better outcome. I mean, for me, I have a personal preference on, all right, let's collaborate and be excellent to each other and make a better organization. But when there is a massive focus on, hey, we've got to push as much product out the door as possible, this slightly more aggressive approach, I hopefully should temper and make people actually realize, hey, this is the approach you should be taking. So I guess bottom line up front, make sure that you pull your SOCs up regularly, call them out for anything that they need to be looking at, and actually really hammer home hard on some of the activities that your SOC should actually be doing. Folks, look, that ends my presentation. We've got about 5 to 8 minutes for questions. So
yeah, we've got plenty of time for questions.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Ed. I said before, it's great seeing friends up on stage, be it virtual or not. And having a look through the chat as you were presenting, I think the sentiment was amen. Definitely. And speaking from personal experience of being on the red team side for a very long time, also that testing the SOC is something that you should do on a regular basis. And just a point to add as well, and actually too, with around testing outsourced and third-party SOCs, the experience that I've had with decision makers has always been a quite well-timed one, because they've been in renegotiation the potential kind of avenue. Have you had similar kind of?
So I would actually say that probably the best one we had in the last few months was when the SOC was actually getting introduced. These guys had 5 tasks that formed part of their SLA, and funnily enough, we identified that their product didn't actually do any of them, which was quite useful because these guys were about to do a massive push into the Australian market, so they've had to go back and do a ton of improvements, which was something I was quite happy with. I mean, it was a little embarrassing on their side, but to have that happen as opposed to these guys having to deal with the liability of getting hit later was good. But yeah, the renegotiation of contracts piece is something that I think we've only done once in the last 2 years. A lot of this has kind of been more business as usual activity.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Fantastic. So we do have some questions coming in. What was around, do you have any or target KPIs or anything of the like that you can share or maybe talk through as well here?
Yeah, let me bring up some of the stuff that we've had in the past. I'm happy. So that individual, if you have a look at my slide deck there, there is an email address. There's also a QR code if you trust me. But yeah, feel free to email, and you know, I can send you over a few samples that we've had around specific and measurable requirements.
Fantastic. And some other questions kind of popping in. How does the monthly pen test program go testing SOCs?
It depends. So there's an organisation that we've just started working with that actually wants to go down that monthly program, but that's also because they've got the depth of capability to deal with a monthly program. The thing I'd caution against with monthly pen test programs is how do you make sure that you are not demoralising the SOC, but also are you varying and changing things up are you varying and changing things up enough so that your team's actually cycling through iteratively into other parts of the organisation? So we've now got that with a client of ours where we've said, okay, look, the internal environment, none of your staff are in-house, so this sudden change you've done with these applications, let's actually see that your monitoring capability works on those and that you're actually recording the right set of logs in those apps. So, yeah.
Fantastic. And we've got another one. We've got plenty coming through. This is fantastic. You've got plenty of time as well. So Melissa asked, there seems to be a focus on SOCs. What about internal SOCs? Any differences to approach to monitoring internal SOCs?
Yeah, so I guess you're looking at, with a third-party SOC, you actually have a clearly specified contract and a clear set of requirements there. Internal SOCs, really comes back to how big's the organisation, and are you doing, like, say, for example, internal unit billing? Have a look at how the business is structured, and probably even evolve it more into that sort of educational activity when you're dealing with an internal environment. So I talked before about that purple teaming approach. That may be a little bit more appropriate than doing, say, a more, what I would call a darker approach where you're focusing on cost recovery. So that piece would probably be, from an internal standpoint, better focused if you were educating that internal team.
Yeah. Another point to add there, I think, would be also whether you come from a culture of SLAs as well. Something embedded in the culture, tack on, be part of a larger conversation you have to have first in order to drive those things. But if it's security, talking to an internal security team, then mostly it will be an internal conversation you can easily have. We've got another question from Paul. Do you know of any template that captures roles and responsibilities and the activity split decisions?
Interesting question. I would say it would vary from context to context. In terms of actually templating things, nothing immediately comes to mind. But I think if you can come back to actually what's the intent of the activity and who's doing what, that's actually a very valuable one to pull out there. If we come back to you on that, I think templating responsibility should be good. Otherwise, I recall some of my father's talks when he was doing management at a strategy level out of the Macquarie Graduate School, where he actually said, well, here's actually how your service level agreement should be focused. And that was more for other capability provisions. But let me come. So who asked that one?
That was Paul Mauricus.
Okay.
So I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing your surname, but I know how you feel. Look at mine.
Paul, I've got a few ideas around that one. So thank you.
Fantastic. And actually, do you have any success stories from stocks that have detected activities, and were they like what were they doing differently in that from what you saw?
So there's two that comes to mind. Actually, one of the favorite crews that we've come up against was CrowdStrike. And I think that was a mix of their tooling, a mix of their personnel, but they also actually, upon identification of us being in play, they actually started alerting the client, hey, we've just seen this, we're starting to diagnose, and then the client was able to come to us and say, hey guys, you've just been seen. That was epic. We got picked in about 30 seconds. And then these guys responded within 3 to 5 minutes. And it was just, there wasn't any fancy tool sets they were using. It was just good management on their part.
Fantastic. I love having conversations like that with internal teams as well, or even if it's third parties, and say, how did you get us? That kind of conversation.
It was brilliant. We had it with, so one of my juniors, Jordan, just had this yesterday, where he found an avenue of approach for one of our clients. The SOC picked him out within about 45 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. So we have improvements. This isn't a talk of woe. There's some really good organisations out there, but I think we're starting to see. For me, I've already seen a lot of bad actors that are already out there, as well as new organisations that probably haven't hit that level of maturity yet. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, I can definitely concur. During my red team days, being a red team is getting a lot harder. So with that, I think we might kind of finish it up there. There was one more question in the Q&A, but if you could kindly reach out to Ed directly and take that one offline. We'll move over to our next speaker. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Ed.
No worries. So,
that was fantastic talk. That was great.
Yeah, enjoy
great seeing you again.
Yeah, fantastic.